Late April 1945. The air, pregnant with the metallic scent of distant cannon fire and the acrid tang of burning timber, hung heavy over the shattered landscape east of the Elbe River, deep within the dying heart of the Third Reich. Here, the war was no longer a grand strategy. It was a desperate scramble for survival, a chaotic, uncoordinated retreat across a nation that was tearing itself apart. The engine of the Jeep, a workhorse seemingly immune to the pervasive despair, idled with a quiet hum, a stark contrast to the frantic desperation that now defined Germany. Behind the steering wheel, Captain T. Moffett Burris, a paratrooper from South Carolina, gripped the cold metal, his knuckles bone-white beneath the grime of 6 relentless days of combat. His eyes, though weary, held a spark of an almost reckless curiosity as they scanned the dusty windshield. Before him, stretching into the hazy distance, was a sight that should have frozen the blood in his veins. A German military column, not dozens, but hundreds of vehicles, a serpentine beast of steel and desperate men. Tanks, their barrels lowered in defeat, but still menacing, half-tracks bristling with machine guns, artillery pieces on their cumbersome carriages, troop carriers overflowing with soldiers, and supply trucks laden with whatever could be salvaged from the collapse. This was not a scattered group of demoralized stragglers. This was an organized military formation, a full Panzer Corps, estimated at a staggering 15,000 troops, still armed, still capable of inflicting immense carnage. Behind Burris, in the Jeep, sat his lieutenant and a sergeant. Their M1 Garand rifles held ready, yet woefully, impossibly inadequate against the overwhelming force that awaited them. The moment that was about to unfold would defy every known principle of military logic, every tactical manual, every lesson learned in the crucible of 2 years of relentless fighting. 1 Jeep, 3 American paratroopers, 15,000 enemy troops, with their tanks, their artillery, their automatic weapons. The math was not just unfavorable, it was absurd. What happened next was not supposed to be possible. Yet, within 30 minutes, the entire German force, a formidable, armed entity, would lay down their arms without firing a single shot. This was not the result of superior firepower. It was not a grand tactical maneuver meticulously planned by a general. It was the product of one man's audacity, a bluff so outlandish, so utterly improbable, that it should have been met with scorn and immediate violence. Instead, it would find fertile ground in the psychological collapse of an army caught between 2 advancing superpowers, between the merciless vengeance of the Soviets from the east and the methodical, if less brutal, advance of the Western Allies. The path to this impossible moment began not in the fields of Germany, but in a small, quiet town in South Carolina. It was a journey that would transform a mild-mannered schoolteacher into a battle-hardened paratrooper, a man who, in the final, chaotic days of the deadliest war in human history, would stumble into an opportunity to write his own improbable chapter, a testament to the power of pure, unadulterated nerve. The war was ending. But for Captain Burris, the greatest gamble of his life was just about to begin. The road ahead was clogged with fear and desperation. And he, with his tiny crew, was about to drive straight into it. To truly comprehend the impossible gamble Captain Burris was about to undertake, one must first immerse oneself in the psychological landscape of Germany in late April 1945. This was not the Germany of early war, fueled by fervent ideology and the intoxication of victory. This was the twilight of the Reich, a nation utterly broken, physically pulverized, and psychologically shattered. The war, for all but the most fanatical, was irrevocably lost. From the east, the Soviet Red Army, a vast and vengeful tide, was closing on Berlin. Their advance was fueled by years of unimaginable suffering, 20 million Soviet citizens dead, cities razed, a nation nearly destroyed. They came with a hunger for retribution that terrified the German populace and military alike. Stories, often exaggerated but rooted in brutal truth, circulated like wildfire through the retreating German lines. Mass executions, brutal treatment of prisoners, systematic reprisals. True or not, every Wehrmacht soldier believed them. The prospect of Soviet captivity was a chilling nightmare that haunted every man in field gray, a fate worse than death for many. From the west, the American and British forces advanced with relentless, methodical power. Their advance, though destructive, was tempered by adherence to the Geneva Convention. American captivity, by contrast, seemed almost civilized. Prisoners were generally treated humanely. Officers were not summarily executed. For a German soldier, surrendering to the Americans offered a slim but tangible hope of survival. This stark choice, Soviet brutality or American adherence to international law, created a powerful, almost magnetic pull towards the Western Front. The entire social order of Germany had completely collapsed. Authority, once absolute, no longer existed. Roads were clogged with millions of refugees, a vast, terrified stream of humanity pushing carts loaded with their meager possessions, children crying, old people stumbling along in exhaustion. Fear ruled everything. A primal, overwhelming fear of what would happen when the two mighty armies finally met, and what would be left in their wake. German military units, cut off from central command, often out of fuel, ammunition, and food, were simply trying to reach the imagined safety of the Western Allied lines before being enveloped by the Soviets. They fought with the desperation of cornered animals. But their will to continue the fight, especially against the Western Allies, was rapidly evaporating. This was the backdrop against which Burris and his 3 men found themselves. They were not facing a disciplined, ideologically driven force, fighting for every inch of ground. They were facing an army on the verge of psychological disintegration, caught in an impossible vice, desperate for any pathway to a less terrible fate. Burris, with his keen understanding of human nature, honed in years of brutal combat, would instinctively grasp this critical psychological dynamic. He would understand that in this twilight of desperation, perception mattered more than reality, and a well-placed lie, delivered with unwavering confidence, could be more powerful than 1,000 tanks. The tension was palpable, the stakes unimaginably high, And into this maelstrom, a single jeep was about to drive. Thomas Moffett Burris was not born a warrior. His roots were in the quiet, unassuming textile mill country of Anderson, South Carolina, where he entered the world on the 22nd of September 1919. By his own description, he was an easygoing, small-town boy who hadn't been in a fight in years. After graduating from Clemson University, he embarked on a path that seemed destined for serene normalcy. A teaching position at Orangeburg High School, imparting history to teenagers in rural South Carolina. His future appeared set, a quiet life of academic pursuit and community involvement. Then came the 7th of December, 1941, and the world irrevocably changed. Pearl Harbor shattered America's isolation, and within days, the United States was plunged into global war. Burris, a reserve officer from his ROTC days at Clemson, received his orders to report for active duty in January 1942. At 22, the schoolteacher became a soldier, but not just any soldier. Burris, driven by a nascent and then unrecognized hunger for challenge, volunteered for the Paratroopers. The training was brutal, designed to weed out all but the most determined. Jump school pushed men to their absolute physical and mental limits. Many washed out, but Burris thrived. He discovered a hidden core of resilience, a capacity for leadership under unimaginable pressure, an innate ability to remain calm when chaos erupted around him, and a willingness to take calculated risks that terrified others. In April 1942, Burris was assigned to the newly forming 82nd Airborne Division, becoming the very first officer assigned to the 3rd Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The 82nd, nicknamed the All-American Division for its diverse recruits, forged men from every corner of the Union farm boys, factory workers, cowboys, dock workers into one of the most formidable fighting units in American military history. The 504th Parachute Infantry, however, would earn a different, more visceral nickname from the Germans who fought them: the Devils in Baggy Pants. The name, discovered in a diary entry of a dead German officer after the brutal Battle of Anzio, referred to the distinct paratrooper uniforms. The officer had written that American parachutists were devils in baggy pants who were never more dangerous than when they were surrounded. It was a compliment of the highest order from an enemy who rarely gave them lightly, acknowledging a terrifying, relentless tenacity that defined Burris and his men. By May 1943, Burris and his regiment shipped out to North Africa. His first combat jump came on the 9th of July, 1943, during the invasion of Sicily. The C-47 transport aircraft bucked and bounced through heavy anti-aircraft fire, and men vomited from fear and air sickness. When the green light flashed, Burris jumped into the darkness over enemy territory, landing in an olive grove. He gathered his scattered platoon and fought his way to the objective, a baptism by fire that honed his burgeoning leadership skills. It was the first of many times he would lead men into seemingly impossible situations, forging the steel of his character, preparing him for the ultimate bluff that lay ahead. September 1943 brought the invasion of Italy, a grinding, brutal campaign that further hardened Burris. At Salerno, the 504th jumped behind German lines to disrupt enemy reinforcements. Burris led his company through 5 days of continuous combat, often outnumbered, always outgunned, but never defeated. Lieutenant General Mark Clark would later credit the 504th with saving the Salerno beachhead. Then came Anzio in January 1944, an amphibious landing that quickly devolved into a 4-month nightmare of trench warfare. German artillery pounded American positions daily. Casualties mounted. Burris was wounded twice but famously refused evacuation, learning in the muddy foxholes that war was not glory but survival, and the grim art of keeping men fighting when everything told them to surrender. But the defining crucible moment of Burris's war, the one that truly honed his audacity and his understanding of calculated risk, came in September 1944. Operation Market Garden. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery conceived an ambitious plan to end the war by Christmas. Airborne forces would seize a series of vital bridges across the Netherlands, creating a narrow corridor for armored units to drive into Germany. The 82nd Airborne was tasked with capturing the crucial bridge over the Waal River at Nijmegen. Without it, the entire operation would fail. On the 20th of September 1944, Burris received the order that would test every lesson he had learned. His company would cross the Waal River in collapsible canvas boats in broad daylight under concentrated German machine gun and artillery fire. Then, they would assault fortified positions on the far bank. By any objective measure, it was a suicide mission. British officers called it impossible. Burris's own men knew the horrific odds, yet not a single man refused. 26 British canvas assault boats, each 19 feet long, plywood bottoms, wooden frames, were brought forward. Designed to carry 10 paratroopers and 3 engineers, they were packed with 13 paratroopers and 3 engineers, 16 men total. Most boats had only 2 or 3 paddles instead of the standard 8, forcing paratroopers to use rifle butts as improvised oars. The Waal River was 400 yards wide at the crossing point. German positions commanded every inch of the approach, firing from well-prepared strong points and the commanding heights of the dike. The crossing launched at 2:57 inches the afternoon into a hellish symphony of destruction. As the boats pushed off from the southern bank, machine gun fire tore into them immediately. Artillery shells exploded in the water. Geysers of spray mingled with blood. Men screamed and died. Boats capsized, spilling their human cargo into the cold, red-stained river. Burris commanded I Company in one of the 2 lead boats of the first wave. His boat took multiple hits within seconds. Private First Class Willard Jenkins, the engineer steering the boat, was killed by a 20mm shell that shattered his head, his blood and brains spilling onto Burris's lap. Shrapnel from the same blast wounded Burris in the ribs. Yet Burris, wounded and drenched in the blood of his comrade, kept his men paddling, his voice a raw, desperate roar against the din. The crossing, which lasted an eternal 15 to 20 minutes, was pure hell. They reached the far bank, with just 6 men left from his 16. Half his company died in that crossing. Only 13 boats from the first wave reached the northern shore intact. Total casualties for the assault reached between 24 and 48 killed, and approximately 70 seriously wounded. But they had made it across. Under murderous fire, Burris rallied the survivors. They charged the German positions, hand-to-hand combat in the trenches, grenades and bayonets. No mercy asked and none given. Inch by inch, they fought their way inland, and by nightfall, they held the northern end of the Nijmegen Bridge. British tanks were supposed to exploit their success immediately. 4 Sherman tanks from the 2nd Grenadier Guards crossed the bridge around 7 that evening. But then they stopped. Burris, holding the ground he had bought with so much blood, waited at the bridge. The tanks did not advance. A British tank commander, Captain Peter Carrington, told Burris they could not advance without orders, and because a single German anti-tank gun blocked the road. Burris, who had just sacrificed half his company taking that bridge, exploded with a rage forged in the fires of Anzio and the blood of the Waal. I have just sacrificed half of my company in the face of dozens of guns, and you will not move because of one gun. Multiple American officers, including Major Cook, Colonel Tucker, and General Gavin himself, subsequently tried to convince British forces to advance. The tanks remained stationary for 18 to 24 hours, not advancing until 11 the following morning, September 21. By then, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's battalion, holding the critically important Arnhem Bridge 11 miles away, had been overpowered. The British paratroopers, who desperately needed relief, were forced to surrender. Lord Carrington, who later became British Foreign Secretary, denied the confrontation in his autobiography, but multiple American paratrooper accounts corroborate the incident and the intense frustration. Burris received the Silver Star for the Waal River crossing, the citation praising his brilliant and inspirational leadership and heroism in securing the north end of the vital Nijmegen Highway Bridge. But Burris knew the truth. Bravery alone had not won that battle. Audacity had. The willingness to attempt what seemed impossible, the capacity to bluff when the odds were hopeless. These lessons, etched in blood and fire, would serve him well just 6 months later, preparing him for the ultimate bluff on a German road. December 1944 brought the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final, desperate offensive through the Ardennes forest. The 82nd Airborne, a division by now synonymous with resilience, rushed into combat with little food, ammunition, or winter clothing. They deployed to Werbermont, Belgium, and blocked Kampfgruppe paper at Chenot, delivering the Germans their first defeat of the Battle of the Bulge. Burris and his men held their positions against German tanks and artillery, fighting in sub-zero temperatures, enduring constant bombardment. They did not break. By February 1945, they were pushing into Germany itself, a relentless advance towards the inevitable end. The final months of the war became a desperate race. Soviet forces advanced from the east, a massive, vengeful tide. American and British forces drove from the west, a methodical, powerful advance. Germany was being crushed between two massive armies. Hitler's thousand-year Reich was collapsing in fire and blood. But the fighting was not over. German units, trapped between the advancing Allies, fought with the desperation of men who knew they were doomed, clinging to a fading hope or simply fighting to avoid the Soviets. On the 2nd of May 1945, the 82nd Airborne Division liberated the Werberlin concentration camp near Ludwigslust. What Burris and his men found there defied comprehension. Approximately 3,500 to 4,000 prisoners, mere skeletons covered in skin, barely alive. Approximately 1,000 dead bodies lay in open pits, some with evidence of cannibalism among the starving. The stench was overwhelming. Men who had fought through 2 years of combat witnessed unspeakable horrors, vomited at the sight. Burris, reacting with furious resolve, shot the lock off a door to liberate prisoners. He was among the first Americans to witness these atrocities, and he immediately ordered his troops to document everything with photographs. The world needed to see this. The world needed proof of what the Nazi regime had done. Burris later stated, "The concentration camp in Germany was the worst thing I saw during the entire war." He ordered the townspeople of Ludwigslust to tour the camp, forcing German civilians to see what had been done in their name. On May 7, the 82nd Airborne conducted funeral services for 200 victims in the town square. Citizens of Ludwigslust captured German officers, and several hundred American paratroopers attended. The division chaplain delivered a stinging eulogy. "The crimes here, committed in the name of the German people, and by their acquiescence, were minor compared to those found in other German concentration camps. Here there are no gas chambers, no crematoria. These men of Holland, Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and France were simply allowed to starve to death within 4 miles of your comfortable homes. 4,000 men were forced to live like animals." Burris stood at attention during the service. He had seen terrible things in this war. Friends blown apart by artillery, men drowning in the Waal River, the charnel house of Anzio. But nothing compared to Werberlin. Nothing revealed the depths of human evil like that camp. He knew then that defeating Germany was not enough. The world needed to ensure this never happened again. By late April 1945, Allied commanders faced a strategic decision. Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from the east. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower ordered American troops to halt at the Elbe and allow Soviet forces to take Berlin. The political arrangements for post-war Germany had already been negotiated at the Yalta Conference. Berlin would fall within the Soviet occupation zone. There was no military purpose in American forces fighting their way into a city that would be handed to the Soviets anyway. But Burris chafed at the order. He was 25 years old. He had been fighting for nearly 3 years. Berlin was 40 miles away. The war was almost over, and he was supposed to just sit and wait. It went against everything in his nature. Burris was a man of action. Waiting was torture. The stage was set for a decision that would redefine his war. On a day in late April 1945, the exact date, now blurred by the passage of time and the chaos of memory, Captain T. Moffett Burris reached his breaking point. The orders to halt at the Elbe River, to sit idly by while the final, bloody chapters of the war were written just beyond their reach, grated against every fiber of his being. He was a man of action, a paratrooper who had thrived in the maelstrom of combat, who had led from the front, taking calculated risks that made others blanch. This enforced idleness, this sterile waiting, was a torment worse than any German barrage. He later recalled telling his lieutenant and sergeant, "I cannot stand this any longer. Let us get in my jeep and drive across the river and see what we can see. See if there are some krauts still over there." It was not an official order. It was not an authorized reconnaissance mission, meticulously planned and approved by higher command. It was, in essence, a lark, a rogue expedition born of Burris's restless curiosity and his profound distaste for inaction. 3 paratroopers, hardened by years of brutal fighting in a single dusty jeep driving into enemy territory because their captain was curious and restless. They drove approximately 40 miles, roughly halfway to Berlin, a journey into the heart of a broken nation. The roads were clogged, not with military columns, but with refugees, millions of German civilians fleeing the relentless Soviet advance from the east. Families pushed carts loaded with their last possessions. Children cried, their faces streaked with dirt and fear. Old people stumbled along in exhaustion, their eyes hollow, their bodies frail. The social order of Germany had completely collapsed. There was no authority, no government, only the raw, primal instinct of survival. Fear ruled everything, a palpable, suffocating blanket that hung heavy in the air. The trio in the jeep became invisible, just another element in the vast, terrified procession. For miles, they encountered no organized military resistance, just the desperate civilian tide. But then, ahead on the road, Burris saw something that made his blood run cold, something that shattered the illusion of an empty, retreating enemy. German military vehicles, dozens of them, then hundreds, an entire column, stretching as far as he could see, snaking through the war-torn landscape. Tanks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, troop carriers, supply trucks. This was not a scattered group of deserters or a broken remnant of a unit. This was an organized military formation, a full Panzer Corps, probably 15,000 troops or more, still armed, still cohesive, still capable of fighting. The smart play, the textbook response, would have been to turn around immediately. 3 men in a jeep had no business confronting an armored corps. Retreat, report the enemy position, and let division headquarters decide how to handle it. That was the logical, cautious choice. But Captain Burris did not become one of the most decorated officers in the 82nd Airborne by always making the cautious choice. He had a different idea, a crazy idea, an idea that made no logical sense whatsoever. But it just might work. He would drive straight toward the German column. His lieutenant and sergeant, silent but resolute, checked their rifles. If this went wrong, they knew they would go down fighting. The bluff of a lifetime was about to be put into motion. The jeep rolled forward, its modest presence a stark, almost laughable, contrast to the armored might of the German column it approached. Burris's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. But outwardly, his face was a mask of unyielding confidence. This was a moment not for rational assessment, but for audacity, for the kind of bluff that Burris had been perfecting since he jumped into Sicily 2 years prior. The jeep pulled up to the lead vehicle in the German column. A German officer stood beside it, his uniform impeccably maintained, despite the visible signs of a desperate retreat. Burris noticed the man wore a captain's insignia. Critically, the German spoke English. That was lucky, Burris would later recall. Burris climbed out of the jeep and walked directly towards the German captain. He kept his hands away from his sidearm, projecting no aggressive moves, just pure, absolute confidence. "I am here to accept your surrender," Burris announced. His voice was steady, matter-of-fact, as if this was the most natural thing in the world, as if he had not just driven 40 miles behind enemy lines with 2 other men to confront 15,000 German soldiers. The German captain stared at him in disbelief, his eyes darting past Burris to the jeep. 2 men, 1 vehicle, no supporting troops, no tanks, no artillery, nothing. The captain's face registered confusion, then suspicion, then something approaching amusement. "Are you crazy?" the German captain asked, his English heavily accented. 3 men and a jeep? It was a fair question. Burris was indeed taking an extraordinary risk. But this was not a moment for rational assessment. This was a moment for the kind of audacious gamble that separated the survivors from the statistics. Burris looked the German captain straight in the eye, his gaze unflinching. "I have a whole army of paratroopers and tanks right behind me," Burris said, his voice calm, even-toned. "And the Russians are right behind you. Do you want to surrender to us or to them?" It was a magnificent lie. There was no army of paratroopers behind Burris. There were no tanks. There was nothing but the same empty road they had driven down. But the German captain did not know that. And, more importantly, the German captain desperately wanted to believe there might be an American army nearby. Because if there was not, his only option was to surrender to the Soviets. And every German soldier knew what that meant. The bluff had been delivered. Now, Burris could only stand and wait, his heart pounding, as the fate of 15,000 men hung in the balance of a single lie. The air crackled with an almost unbearable tension. The German captain, confronted by Captain Burris's audacious lie, was trapped in a moral and strategic vice. He knew the terrifying reputation of the Soviet Red Army. Over 20 million Soviet citizens had died in the war. Their cities had been burned, their people enslaved, their nation nearly destroyed. The Soviets advanced into Germany with a hunger for vengeance that paralyzed German troops with fear. Stories, though some exaggerated, of mass executions, brutal treatment of prisoners, and systematic reprisals circulated with chilling efficacy. True or not, German soldiers believed them implicitly. The prospect of Soviet captivity was a nightmare that haunted every Wehrmacht officer, a fate many considered worse than death. American captivity, by contrast, seemed almost civilized. The Americans, for all their destructive power, adhered to the Geneva Convention. They treated prisoners humanely, did not execute officers on sight, and offered the prospect of eventual release. The German captain, a professional soldier, knew all this. He stood in the road, weighing his options. He faced a stark choice. 1. Call the Americans' bluff. Order his men to disarm these 3 paratroopers, continue the chaotic retreat toward wherever they were going, and inevitably fall into Soviet hands. This meant certain brutality and likely death for many of his men. 2. Accept Burris's offer, surrender to the Americans, avoid the Red Army, and seize a chance, however slim, to survive the war with some dignity. The decision was clear. The captain said, "Wait a minute." He turned and walked back down the column, his boots crunching on the dusty road. Burris watched him gather 3 or 4 other German officers. They formed a small, agitated group beside one of the vehicles, gesturing wildly. Some pointed toward Burris and his jeep. Others pointed east, toward the approaching Soviet lines. The debate continued for several minutes, a furious, desperate argument over the fate of 15,000 men. Burris stood perfectly still, his face a mask of absolute confidence, though inside his heart hammered against his ribs. This could go either way. Finally, the German captain broke away from the group and walked back to Burris. His hand moved to his holster. Burris tensed, his lieutenant and sergeant in the jeep raising their rifles slightly. This was it. Either surrender or combat. The German captain pulled his pistol from the holster. For a brief, terrifying moment, Burris thought, "Oh no, not here, in the last few days of the war." But then, the captain turned the pistol around, grip first, and extended it toward Burris. It was the universal, unmistakable gesture of military surrender. Burris accepted the pistol, a symbol of a monumental victory won by sheer nerve. He nodded to the German captain, a respectful acknowledgement of a professional soldier's agonizing decision. The captain saluted. Behind him, like a ripple spreading through water, the words spread down the column, "Surrender! The Americans have arrived! We are surrendering!" German soldiers began dismounting from their vehicles. They stacked their rifles, they removed their sidearms, and placed them on the ground. Officers organized their men into orderly groups. The discipline held, even in defeat. This was still a professional military force, but it was a defeated one, choosing the lesser of 2 evils. The bluff had worked. Burris, with 3 men and a jeep, had just accepted the surrender of an entire Panzer Corps. With the surrender complete, Captain Burris faced an immediate and utterly absurd problem. He had 15,000 German prisoners and absolutely no way to guard them or transport them. He had no communication with his division, no backup, no logistical support. He had 3 men and 1 jeep and an army of newly disarmed enemy soldiers waiting for instructions. The situation was beyond ludicrous, a darkly comedic tableau in the midst of a collapsing empire. Burris, ever the pragmatic leader, immediately took charge. He ordered the German officers to maintain control of their troops and begin marching west toward the American lines. The Germans, relieved to have a clear directive and the promise of American captivity, obeyed. Burris and his 2 men followed in the jeep, bringing up the rear of the column like shepherds, herding a massive, field-gray flock. They drove for hours. The column of German soldiers stretched for miles, a river of humanity flowing towards an uncertain future. They passed through destroyed villages and abandoned checkpoints, occasionally encountering bewildered American patrols who stared in amazement at the sight. Where did all these prisoners come from? They would ask, their voices filled with disbelief. The story spread quickly through American lines. Captain Burris, with just a jeep and 2 other men, had accepted the surrender of an entire Panzer Corps. Nobody could quite believe it. When Burris finally reached 82nd Airborne headquarters, his colonel was waiting. The colonel was, understandably, not happy. Burris had flagrantly defied orders, driven deep into enemy territory without authorization, and taken unnecessary risks that could have resulted in his death or capture and a diplomatic incident. The colonel did not know whether to court-martial him for insubordination or commend him for an act of astonishing bravery and strategic gain. For several days, Burris waited to learn his fate. Some officers argued he had shown a dangerous disregard for orders and military discipline. Others pointed out, with undeniable logic, that he had just captured 15,000 enemy soldiers without firing a shot, saving countless American lives that would have been lost in a conventional assault. In the end, the army decided that results mattered more than procedure. Burris was recommended for commendation rather than punishment. The audacious act, though unorthodox, had paid off beyond measure. Years later, when asked about the incident, Burris was characteristically modest. "I needed a plan, and quick," he said. The plan had been simple: bluff with absolute confidence, offer the Germans a choice between 2 outcomes, one of which was clearly preferable, and pray they took the bait. It had worked because Burris, a man who had seen the psychological toll of 2 years of war, understood something fundamental about military psychology in April 1945. The German army was broken, not just militarily, but psychologically. They knew the war was lost. Hitler's promises were lies. They were terrified of the Soviets and exhausted from years of fighting. All they wanted was a way out. And Burris, with his insane bluff, had given them one. The war in Europe officially ended on the 8th of May, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted a mere 12 years. The 82nd Airborne Division, fresh from its final campaigns, received the honor of occupation duty in Berlin. General George S. Patton reviewed the paratroopers and bestowed upon the division a new nickname, America's Guard of Honor. Burris, standing in formation, a captain at 25, a veteran of 4 major campaigns and one of the most decorated officers in the Airborne, listened as Patton addressed them. "You are soldiers who jumped into hell and fought your way out." The war had transformed him, imbuing him with a wisdom and understanding of human nature that would shape the rest of his long and distinguished life. Burris returned to South Carolina after the war, married, started a family, and entered the construction business, eventually founding his own successful firm with his 3 sons. From 1977 to February 1990, he served in the South Carolina House of Representatives, bringing the same direct, honest, results-focused leadership he learned in combat to civilian politics. He was instrumental in building the modern Republican Party in South Carolina, serving as minority leader for 9 years. His wartime experiences continued to echo. In 1977, the film A Bridge Too Far told the story of Operation Market Garden, with actor Robert Redford playing a composite character partly based on Burris's actions at Nijmegen. Burris consulted on the film, watching the recreation of the Waal River crossing, the memories flooding back the machine guns, his men dying in the boats, the cold water rising. In 2000, at age 80, he published his memoir, Strike and Hold, a memoir of the 82nd Airborne in World War II, a first-hand account of what it meant to lead men in combat, what it cost, what it took, what it left behind. But it was in his later years, as he approached and surpassed the age of 90, that Burris truly became a living legend. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of Operation Market Garden, he made an airborne jump into Holland, just 4 days shy of his 75th birthday, landing at the original battle site 15 years later. In September 2009, he returned for the 65th anniversary and, at age 90, made a tandem jump, honored by Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands and receiving the Nijmegen Medal of Honor. The people of Holland had not forgotten. For Burris, these visits were profoundly moving. The war had meaning because it had freed people from tyranny. In 2012, at age 92, Burris spoke at Fort Jackson's Army Training Center, captivating commanders and staff as he recounted his combat experiences, including shooting the lock off a concentration camp gate and convincing a German Panzer Corps to surrender. His message was consistent. Good leaders lead from the front. Never ask your people to do something you would not do yourself. Take care of your troops, and they will take care of you. These were not abstract principles. They were lessons learned in blood and fire. When asked about the surrender of the 15,000 German troops, Burris always emphasized the context. It was not about him being brave or clever. It was about understanding the situation. Those German soldiers were terrified of the Soviets. They wanted to surrender to the Americans. All he did was give them the opportunity. Few officers had the audacity to try. His full military decorations included the Silver Star, 3 Bronze Stars with Combat V, a Purple Heart, 3 Presidential Unit citations, and numerous foreign decorations. T. Moffett Burris died on the 4th of January 2019 at age 99. His funeral drew hundreds of mourners, including veterans, politicians, and Dutch citizens who flew across the Atlantic to honor the man who helped liberate their country. Governor Henry McMaster of South Carolina called him one of the finest leaders our state and nation has ever produced. The story of Burris and the German Panzer Corps endures because it captures something essential about the human spirit, the refusal to accept defeat, the willingness to take impossible risks, the understanding that sometimes the most powerful weapon is confidence itself. Some military analysts have questioned the precise numbers or exact details, but the core of the story is indisputable. In the final days of the war, Moffett Burris encountered a large German military formation and, using nothing but confidence and psychological pressure, convinced them to surrender without a fight. The exact numbers may be uncertain, the precise details may have blurred with time, but the essential truth remains. One man's audacity accomplished what an army might have struggled to achieve through force. It illustrates the chaos and fluidity of war's final days, where individuals like Burris had opportunities to shape events in ways impossible under normal military discipline. He violated direct orders, drove into enemy territory, confronted a force that outnumbered him thousands to one, and lied about reinforcements. He should have been killed or captured. Instead, he pulled off one of the most remarkable bluffs in military history. That combination of audacity, confidence, and calculated risk defines exceptional leadership. The jeep that Burris drove no longer exists. The road where he confronted those 15,000 German soldiers has been rebuilt. The German officers who surrendered that day have passed into history, but the story endures. It endures because it reminds us that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. It reminds us that leadership means standing where you ask others to stand. It reminds us that sometimes the impossible is just the improbable waiting for someone audacious enough to try it. 3 men in a jeep, armed only with confidence and a well-timed bluff, changed the course of history in their own small, profound way. That is,